Welcome back to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Baltimore. We're continuing our conversation with Saadia Toor. She is an associate professor at the College of Staten Island and the City University of New York Graduate Center. She's also the author of the book, State of Islam, Culture and Cold War Politics in Pakistan. Thanks so much for being with us again, Saadia.
Thank you, Jessica.
So, Saadia, I want to start our conversation with talking about the role of the United States. Did the U.S. help create or support these groups that we see now terrorizing civilians in Pakistan? I know that you've said that the Afghan war back in the 80s against the Russians as really the origin of it all. What do you mean by that?
So the landscape of sort of militant religious violence in Pakistan is so vast now that it's sometimes a little bit confusing to people to connect the U.S. to these sectarian outfits, say in southern Punjab. But I can't stress enough how much of all of this can be traced back to that war in the 1980s and to the direct and indirect role played by the U.S. then and now since the war on terror. So let me talk very quickly about the initial Afghan war of the late 70s and 80s. So what that war did, Jessica, was number one, of course, create this entire system of religious militant outfits. Right? So you had the Mujahideen, and it wasn't enough that these were Afghan warriors that were trained to fight the Soviets. They were given this ideological training, which was a form of ideology that had never before existed, this kind of very violent, toxic mix of various kinds of elements concocted together and sort of like with the help of the CIA and the Pakistani intelligence agencies, really fed to these Mujahideen, along with all the training that went with it and the arms and ammunition. And so, of course, once the war there was over, the U.S. decided that it was done. That was a closed chapter. But of course, these things don't end. You can't press pause or sort of end things in this kind of a way. So, of course, as we know, many people are aware of the ways in which the Taliban are literally and metaphorically the children of those Afghan Mujahideen that grew up in refugee camps in Pakistan, and the Pakistani military really trained them as its assets, right? So those are the Afghan Taliban. The Pakistani Taliban were those members of the Afghan Jihad that were Pakistani or lived in the Pakistani side of the tribal areas, and they were inactive up until the war on Afghanistan. Again, this time the war on terror was launched in September 2001. October 2001, I'm sorry. And they basically got, sort of mobilized to fight the US and the Pakistani military, which they very correctly saw as being part of that war on terror initiative. And they initially started by being very separate groups that around 2007 kind of coalesced into what we now know as the TTP. So that is that. And so you can sort of trace that direct lineage from the Afghan war and the US's role in that. But more broadly speaking, what the Afghan war did to Pakistan is a story that is seldom told in the US and is often forgotten in Pakistan as well, because what it really did was it completely destroyed the social and political and cultural fabric of Pakistan. So this, like I said, these toxic ideologies and these toxic networks, very militant extremist networks that were created through that war didn't die out. In fact, they proliferated. The arms and ammunition that became freely available during the Afghan war also ruined the social fabric, and so you saw this rise in sort of the use of violence, not just religious violence, but the use of armed violence in general in Pakistan skyrocket after the 80s in a way that just was not there before. So we came to call it the Kalashnikov culture, right? Like everybody just had a Kalashnikov, and every score that might have been settled in other forms was now settled with gunfire. And so you had all of these things going. On the other side, the Southern Punjab story is one in which the Pakistani security agencies, the ISI, basically created and nurtured a bunch of groups that they were that they were sort of training to go off and fight in Kashmir, because ultimately the main enemy of the Pakistani state is India. So even the Taliban that it trained it really did that so as to sort of shore up Afghanistan against India, right? So, so as a result, as a consequence of what happened in the 1980s or during the 1980s, Ziaul Haq, who was the military dictator at that time, that was supported by the U.S. because of his role in the Afghan war, basically managed to help create these sectarian outfits. So there are lots of groups that people might be familiar with, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, then now the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, the Sipah-Sahaba Pakistan. These are all these Sunni sectarian outfits for whom the issue of blasphemy and the issue of targeting religious minorities is at the very top of their agenda. But what has happened since since the war on terror, and especially in the last 5 or 6 years, is, as I think I mentioned before, the groups like the TTP based in FATA and the sectarian outfits based in southern Punjab that previously had not had anything to do with one another started to build relationships with one another. So you now actually, even though they still have their separate agendas, they are much more in contact now than they were before. And as long as this as the war in Afghanistan continues, I mean, you must have heard Malalai Joya talk about how it's impossible for Afghanistan to come to any lasting peace or to go back to being any kind of a democratic society without the U.S. NATO forces withdrawing, because their presence just completely confuses and not only does not help but actually hurts any hope for Afghanistan.
Saadia, yeah,
Sorry.
that was a very, very good sort of modern history. Can you talk about also, though, the role of a major U.S. ally, Saudi Arabia, in all of this? But because isn't there a strong link between the religious extremism that you point to and sort of the Wahhabism that is being exported out of Saudi Arabia? And speak to some evidence that we have sort of linking Saudi Arabia to these extremist groups.
I mean, I don't know that I can cite specific evidence. It's actually just a very well-known fact historically that Saudi Arabia was involved from the very beginning, even during the Afghan Jihad, in supporting materially these groups. So Saudi Arabia gave a lot of money and has since then been very heavily involved in funding, directly or indirectly, religious extremism in Pakistan. And maybe not, I don't know how involved they are in funding groups like the TTP, but certainly groups in southern Punjab and other religious extremist outfits in Pakistan, the ones that are targeting minorities in particular, receive a lot of material support from Saudi Arabia. So I think that's an excellent point that you bring up, that when we talk about US involvement and US culpability in what is going on in Afghanistan and Pakistan, we must also look to the ways in which this major US ally has been responsible for sort of making such a hash of things.
All right, Saadia Toor, joining us from Jersey City, New Jersey. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jessica.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.